And maybe it's because I said, when the state said Charter should sell off spectrum for not building out its infrastructure to the underserved communities, I said the state should take it over and we should have community broadband, where the people control their community broadband. Study from Stanford looked at community broadband around the country. There are over 100 communities that have it. The rates are lower and the service is better. That's what that study found. And I can tell you from my own city of Syracuse, the franchise agreement with Time Warner, which had it before Spectrum, ran out in 2007. And Time Warner and now Spectrum has not negotiated with the city in good faith to get a new franchise agreement. And they have totally basically fallen short. They keep a franchise fee. It's supposed to go for public, educational, government channels and a public media, public access studio. They have not done that. We have one public access station. The basic channels are like 1 to 16 or whatever it is, and then they put the public access on 98. There's nothing on there. There's no government channels. They don't broadcast. I mean, we have one of the worst. It's called PAY, Public Educational Government. We have one of the worst pay programs in the country. And so that's why we need community broadband. So these are some of the issues I'm raising. The basic theme I'm running on again is a Green New Deal for New York. And the Green New Deal basically says the Democrats never fulfilled the New Deal in its full form, which Franklin Roosevelt articulated in his last State of the Union address in 1945, said everybody ought to have the right to a job or an income above poverty, a decent home, comprehensive health care, and a good education. And he had some other things about fair markets and time for recreation, and that's all good too. And these things were in the Democratic platform from the 40s to the 70s, but they didn't really mean it because they have majorities with every president from Truman to Obama, and they never implemented any of these programs. And the full employment commitment, the job guarantee, was thrown out when Carter gutted the Howie Hawkins bill for full employment in 1978. And then single payer health care, national health insurance, which would provide comprehensive health care for everybody, was knocked out by Clinton when he got the nomination in 1992. Yet so many progressives keep a hope in the Democratic Party. The difference between us and the Democrats is we really mean it. We have programs for every one of these reforms. We got a New York Health Act bill, which will provide single payer in New York. We can talk about that. We have a program to restore progressive taxation, raise $35–40 billion addition to what we're raising now by taxing that 1% about 10% more than they're now paying, or about 10% of the income they now receive. They now receive $375 billion a year. That's 31% of all the income in the state. It's up from 12% in 1980. They're making a killing, and our infrastructure is crumbling. We need $32 billion to fix the New York City Housing Authority, get the mold out, the lead out, get the roofs and the elevators and the boilers fixed, and then we need to expand from there. We need $37 billion for this Fast Forward program to fix the switches and the signals and get the cars and the rails and everything fixed up in the subway system, which is running more and more behind. The Napoli said a few years ago we need $80 billion in additional revenue to fix the roads and bridges and water and sewer systems upstate. If we're going to have a clean energy system, that's on the order of $25 billion a year. I talked about expanding public housing. There's a lot of infrastructure. So with these kind of revenues, we can, put a good chunk in every year to start filling those needs. We can also borrow against it. Now, the best way to do that is a public bank, not going through Wall Street. Through a public bank, a state bank like North Dakota does, they can finance their infrastructure at half the cost we do by bonding through Wall Street with their interest and commission and fees. And the interest comes back to us. It doesn't go to Wall Street. So that's another part of our program. So education. Cynthia Nixon rightly called for fully funding the foundation aid. We're $4.2 billion cumulatively behind on what was promised in 2007 when they enacted that in response to the Campaign for Fiscal Equity court decision. The Great Recession hit and they've never come back up. Cuomo says, well, I keep raising it every year, but it's not enough. especially for the high poverty districts. You know that in Rochester, I know that in Syracuse. But beyond that, we got to call off this high stakes testing regime, which is not about education, it's about business. The hedge funds invest heavily in the charter schools and the testing. The testing is used to evaluate teachers, even though as a scientific matter, we know that teachers at best contribute to it's between 1 and 14% of how well students do on those tests. The other 86% is family background, family income. That's the best predictor. So rather than testing these kids, how about we end poverty? How about we desegregate? That would be real education reform. You can't, put all the burden on the schools. We need broader social reform. So they're doing this high stakes testing, and then they're using that to define the schools that are in the bottom 5% of the bell curve or the curve to say they're failing. And what do? They put them into receivership and send them on to charter schools. And that's where the hedge funds make their money. Juan Gonzalez pointed out in Albany, they were doubling their money. This is in 2010 in the Daily News. They were doubling their investment in 7 years. It's mostly about real estate, but they get a 39% tax credit every year for the money they lend for that. And that plus the interest they get back doubles their money. Now you don't have to look up that Juan Gonzalez article. You can find it in Investopedia. This is business, not education. We got to call off this whole high-stakes testing regime and let the teachers teach. And finally, our schools in New York State are the most segregated in the country by race and class. And we know that the most potent reform that has improved education, that has closed the standardized testing gap between poor students and middle-class students, is integration. And that all the students in those schools do better on measures like intellectual self-confidence, creativity, problem-solving, teamwork, tolerance for other groups, things that we want in our society that are good when you go out to get a job. So there's a lot more we can do besides just full funding on education. So there's this economic Bill of Rights, and we know how to get them, and we really mean it. And then finally, we call it the Green New Deal because we have a climate crisis as well as an environmental crisis. I mentioned the climate crisis and went over why the New York off bill is so much better. I'll just mention a couple more things. It has benchmarks like no new construction that's not net zero carbon after 2020, no vehicles sold in the state that aren't zero emissions after 2025. Every county and every municipality of 50,000 or more has to have a climate action plan integrated into the state plan that will be developed. It has provision for a just transition so that communities and workers affected by the closure of fossil fuel or nuclear plants are made whole during the transition. All these things are in the New York off bill. But beyond the climate thing, we have environmental issues that we have not addressed, and it's criminal neglect by the two major parties. Take the lead crisis. My city of Syracuse, 40% of the children have elevated lead levels. Elevated lead means your motor skill and cognitive development is impaired, and you're likely to have emotional and behavioral problems. And this is lifelong, if it happens when you're a young child. 40% of the children in my city, 40% of the children in Buffalo, 38% of the children in one zip code in Utica, and 28% in the other two. Rochester, you've done better. You're in, the low 20s. That's still criminal. This is 47 years after the Surgeon General issued an urgent warning that we need to test the children, treat them if their blood is elevated, and remediate the sources. And the two parties have neglected this. I know in Rochester you've had some efforts, you've done better, but you haven't done good enough because no child being lead poisoned, or one child being lead poisoned, is too many. And what do we need for the cities to be able to do this? They need the resources. Our cities are squeezed by the austerity that's been imposed by both parties, by putting mandates on that are not funded by the state, by not sharing the revenues. I don't know what you got in Rochester too much. I know better in my city of Syracuse. None of our building inspectors are certified to inspect for lead. And whether it's to find the lead or to certify that the lead has been remediated. One thing I'm calling for is that after a transition period of a few years, no unit should be rented out if they are certified lead safe. That's the kind of thing we need, and that will stimulate private investment as well as the public investment I'm talking about. So we have serious environmental problems. Hoosick Falls you've heard about, right? The PFOS that was in the water, and now they found a plume in the soil going all the way over to Vermont. There are all kinds of environmental cleanup we've got to do. And again, that's, besides being an environmental concern, cleaning it up is a job creator. And it's something we've got to do to leave the earth better than we found it. So that's the Green New Deal. I know some of you wanted to talk about government reform and election reform. Let's talk about that briefly, because New York is corrupt as hell. We've had over 50 state officials driven from office for ethical or criminal violations, including the Senate leader, the Assembly Speaker, and the top aides to Governor Cuomo, his economic czar, and his brother from another mother, Joe Percoco. And Percoco was bribed by the former treasurer of the Democratic National Committee, a guy named Peter Galbraith Kelly Jr., who not only bribed Percoco to get that CPV plant, the Competitive Power Ventures plant that I mentioned earlier, would add 10% to the carbon footprint of New York State with frack gas. He is also a member of a lobbying firm, influence peddling firm, and he's in that firm with a man named Charlie Black, who was a longtime Republican operative who cut his teeth with the first Jesse Helms campaign, that old racist senator from North Carolina. And in the firm in which Charlie Black was and Kelly's father was, you had Roger Stone, Paul Manafort, who's that guy that got caught, that Republican, went to prison?
So many.
Yeah, blanking on his name. But what does that tell us? It tells us after the election and the Democrats and Republicans squabble over gun, guns, gays, and abortion, they get down to business. This firm with Kelly's father and Manafort and Stone and that other crooked Republican that went to prison, they represented people like Mobutu in Zaire and Marcos in the Philippines and tobacco companies and big polluters. I mean, and that's Democrats and Republicans, because Kelly's father was also a big muckety-muck in the Democratic Party power structure. That's what we faced. A two-party state, which is slicker than the old Russian Soviet one-party state, because it gives us the illusion of choice. But it's like Boss Tweed used to say, you can vote for anybody you want as long as I get to pick the candidates. So we have a system where you have a money primary, and that tells you who can get seriously into the primaries, and then you get to choose between them, and whoever survives that, then you get to choose between a Democrat and a Republican. And we call that democracy. And so what can we do in New York State? Well, corruption, we got to restart the Moreland Commission. I'm sure there's a lot more corruption than they found in the brief time they were open before Cuomo shut it down when they started getting too close to his people. We need to close the LLC loophole, obviously. That's where a real estate guy has an LLC for every building. He can give to the limit for every LLC. So one guy actually gave Cuomo $1 million in the last election, even though the limit at that time was $35,000 per donor. So, the donor limits are a joke. We just had the CEO of LinkedIn, a Silicon Valley tech guy, give $250,000 to the Working Families Party. I don't know how you have a workers' party funded by the capitalists. Jonathan Soros, who's the son and heir of George Soros, gave the working families $100,000 in August. And of course, what do? They campaign for Democrats. And when they don't get it directly from the capitalists, they'll have a Clinton or a Schumer go to Wall Street and the real estate barons, get a lot of money, and hire the Working Families Party to do the ground game. We got to stop being fooled by this kind of thing. I heard Carl McCall, when it first came out, tell Sam Roberts, who's now the director of welfare at the time of county legislature, he was an assemblyman in between, and Sam asked Carl McCall, this is in Syracuse, in a bookstore right next to the Green office where we had an inside connection. And I was actually running against McCall for comptroller. This is about 1998. And so I was listening in, and Sam said, what do we need this Working Families Party for? We already got the Democrats. And McCall said, yeah, but we're so conservative now, this is the Clinton years, that a lot of people aren't happy with it. So we're going to give them a new look. That's what the game is. And we got to stop being fooled by that. So that brings up ballot reform. You know, there are really only 3 parties in the state. There are 8 ballot lines, but in the last election, the Republican created 4, or 3. The Democrat Cuomo created 4, and I created 1, the Green Party. And those other 5 ballot lines, besides Democratic, Republican, Green, routinely cross-endorse the Democrat or Republican. So you get this big ballot with, you know, Cuomo, you know, Republican, Hawkins, Green, you know, Cuomo, Republican, Cuomo. You know, the same name appears. Where they have fusion in other states, and I'm not opposed to it, I think it's fine if people want to form coalitions. But what they do is have the candidate once, and then each party then endorse them under their name. So I think that's a ballot reform we could do. I would have every election have a separate page with the candidates ordered in random on each ballot. So you're not favoring one. The Democrats got the most votes, they got the top line. That favors them a lot. And so you'd have a separate page for every race and every ballot referendum. You would have a booklet sent out by the Board of Elections where every candidate, every referendum, and every party could have a statement of about up to, say, 250 words and a sample ballot. So the voters get that, you know, a month before the election or whatever. They can read, they can think, they got it, they got the date in front of them. They do this in California. My little brother actually prints them. He's got a little printing business in Oakland. So I think we can do that. What else? I think the biggest reform is to get away from single-member district winner-take-all elections, because that breeds gerrymandering, where the Democrats and Republicans divide up the votes. They put all the Democrats in one district, all the Republicans in another, create safe seats for themselves. Mm-hmm. We have less turnover here than, as Reagan actually pointed out, Congress had less turnover than the Politburo or the, you know, the biggest Soviet, because they're safe seats and they create, you know, permanent professional politicians with no real challenges. Like I mentioned, this assembly district just to our east, where this is the first year the Republican has had a challenger in 26 years. And we call this democracy. So what we should do is have ranked choice voting for proportional representation in legislative bodies for multi-member seats, and for instant runoff voting for single seats in the executive branch. So I'll explain the executive branch. That's easier to explain. What that means is you go to the poll and you rank your choices of the candidates, 1, 2, 3. It's as easy as 1, 2, 3. And then if nobody gets a majority in the first round, the last place candidate is eliminated, and their second choices are distributed. And that process continues until somebody gets a majority of votes. What that does is let people vote for the candidate they most want, rather than for the lesser evil to stop their greatest fear, which is what we have too much of now. And it inflates the vote that, you know, the Democrats get and deflates the vote that the Greens get. Now on the right, probably deflates the Libertarians and inflates the Republicans. So that's how it works in a single seat. That should be for executive offices. For legislature, like take the assembly, we could have 15 10-member seats, or 10 15-member seats. Districts. So let's say it's 10-member districts. Basically, you'll need 10% of the vote and a little more to get one representative for your party. And what you would do is have the candidates and the parties on the ballot, and you would rank them in order. And the votes are distributed by a similar process as I described, but it's more complicated for multi-members, because you've got to distribute fractional votes of the surplus of winners, and then distribute the last place candidate when they're eliminated, their whole votes. But it's the same principle. And that process is called the single transferable vote. Get you a multi-party system. New York City used it between 1937 and 1945 for 10 municipal elections. They used to be every 2 years back then. And they have between 5 and 7 parties represented on their legislative body. And then the McCarthy era came, and these Labor Party people, American Labor Party people, were getting elected. Some of them were also members of the Communist Party, so they were worried about that. And some of them were actually black. So there was a problem back then as far as the Democrats and Republicans were concerned, who got together and got rid of that. And unfortunately, there was a charter commission where all these progressive Democrats, supposedly progressive Democrats, and New York City had an opportunity to reinstitute that. They didn't get to proportional representation. They did talk about ranked choice voting for the single offices, single seat offices, and then decided not to recommend that. That's why we need a Green Party, because we really mean we want democracy. And then probably the next biggest thing, there are so many reforms we need, and we can talk more about it, but the other big one is public campaign financing. I've talked about how, you know, the big dollars on Wall Street and real estate and so forth are buying politicians. We have a model of full public campaign financing, clean money model that we call it, that I actually demonstrated for it with Citizen Action back in the 90s. Since then, because a lot of money, including Jonathan Soros that I mentioned before, got behind the idea of let's have matching funds, which is the post-Watergate thing. We've got it for presidential primaries. And New York City instituted it in the 90s. But if you look at New York City, all it is a little public money on top of the old pile of crap, the private money from real estate in particular in those municipal elections. So when you watch the media and they're looking who's raising money, they're not looking at the public money people are qualifying for, they're looking at who's raising that private money. And so what we've had is proposed, there was a big push in 2012, both at the congressional level and the state level, and right up through the 2014 election to go this matching fund model statewide. But I think that's a reform that doesn't reform. You'll have still the private money playing a big role, and then you throw some public money on top of it to make it look good. The clean money model has been implemented in Maine and Arizona. And what happens there is you qualify by getting your ballot petitions in and raising a reasonable number of $5 contributions to demonstrate you have support. And then after that, you're given a grant. Every candidate that qualifies and opts in, you have to opt in. We can't require everybody unless we get Buckley v. Vallejo, a Supreme Court decision back in '76, repealed, which allows individuals to spend as much money of their own money as they want. In any case, for those that opt into public financing, everybody would get an equal grant sufficient to reach your voters and be a level playing field, and would get the private money out. If you opt in, you can't take private money. And if you don't opt in, everybody will know you're taking dirty money. So that will do a lot to reduce the temptations of the pay-to-play culture we have here in New York. In Arizona and Maine, most state assembly people, most candidates for statewide office opt in, because even Republicans who are philosophically opposed to public financing of just about anything would rather take that money than dial for dollars. It's a pain in the butt, I can tell you. You know, I actually don't mind when I actually catch somebody, but mostly you get a message machine and you leave your message. I can think of more fun things to do, like talking to voters about the issues. So I've probably gone on more than 10 minutes, so I think it's time for me to stop. Let me just close by saying to the Facebook people, I think people in this room are already with me on this. In 2014, we got 5% of the vote. And Cuomo got less votes than he got in 2010 in terms of the percentage of the vote he got. And he wanted that vote. He wanted to roll it up so he got more than his father and he could get ready to run for president. So he had to look, why did the Greens get 5%? What does I have to do if I'm Andrew Cuomo to get those votes? And what did he do? He banned fracking. He adopted paid family leave. He talked and did a little bit about the $15 minimum wage. Did a little bit about tuition-free college, not much. But we moved him because we got that 5%. If our vote had just gone to Cuomo, even on the working families line, it would have been lost in the sauce. It would have been a vote Cuomo could have taken for granted. So if we had not been there in the general election, we probably wouldn't have got the fracking ban. Now, I give all credit to, you know, the grassroots movement that exploded from 2010 to 2014. We were calling for a fracking ban in 2010 when most of the rest of the movement was calling for a moratorium. Remember that? Petition said moratorium. They wanted to study the water impact. We're saying, yeah, the water, but also the climate. And then it became, because of a couple guys at Cornell, Anthony Ingraffia and Robert Howard, studied the emissions of methane, much more potent greenhouse gas from fracking wells and pipelines and compressor stations, and found out that it was actually worse than burning coal in terms of total greenhouse gas emissions. So, you know, our instincts were right. We just knew we had to stop putting any kind of fossil fuel in the atmosphere. So all credit to the movement that dogged Cuomo during that period, and his Zephyr Teachout, who ran gave voice to that movement in the primary, but I'm telling you, if in the general election there hadn't been another option for people to vote for the fracking ban and some of the other things we're talking about, Cuomo wouldn't have felt threatened, because in the end, that's the vote he's really worried about. And so I'm saying to people, vote for what you want and make the politicians come to you. Don't vote for somebody you really don't support, because nobody will know what you really wanted. So why don't we have a question and answer and discussion?
Well, I'll start by just saying this. Our internet thing was a little goofy and it kept flicking off, so I'm actually recording this and it'll get posted up tonight. So we're not live, but it's going up tonight. Just letting folks know.
Yep.
So if you accidentally swear, I can edit it out.
Oh, what the hell?
Unless you tell me not to.
A report just came out, Howie, I don't know if you saw, about poverty and child poverty in cities, which put Syracuse
In the top 10 for
at Rochester, Rochester third for child poverty, Syracuse I think sixth or fifth or sixth for child poverty, and overall poverty numbers, Syracuse ninth and Rochester 12th. If elected, what could you do to try to reduce the poverty level in these big cities?
Okay, the reason people are poor is they don't have enough money. You get all these liberals saying, oh, you know, we need to school them better, we got to give them job training, you know, we got to teach them how to do a budget or whatever. And the fact is, if these folks had a job that paid a living wage, there wouldn't be much of a problem. You know, some people have drug problems and alcohol problems and behavioral problems, okay, but I can find you a lot of middle class people that do too, okay? So we got to raise the wage, $15 an hour. By the time we get to it upstate, you know, it's only $10.40 now. It'll be $12.50 when we get into 2021, and then they're going to study if we should go to 15. That's still a poverty wage, especially, you know, with the inflation we'll have by then. The real wages of people are down $1 less than they were in 1973, the average wage. And the lower you are in the income scale, you've lost ground. So, you know, the working poor are poorer than they were in 1973. So we got to raise the minimum wage. It's time to start talking about $20 an hour. I'm saying 20 by 20. By the end of 2020, we should have a minimum wage of $20 and index it, unlike we did with this $15 minimum wage, to inflation and to productivity. If the minimum wage nationally in 1968 had kept pace with both inflation and productivity, it'd be over $29 an hour now. And so we are producing more, and the 1% is getting what the extra we're producing. So I'm saying 20 by 20 and 30 by 30. And I've got that in my platform. You can read the statistics, you know, and where I got those numbers. So that's first. We got to stop wage theft. There's $1 billion of wages stolen from low-wage workers in this state every year. And the enforcement is pathetic. They recover about $22 million a year since 2010. And often the court orders that the employer pay, and the employer disappears. You know, they'll sell the business to their uncle or their brother and say, we're not that business, we're a new business. And there's no repercussion for that. So there's a piece of legislation we need to pass. It's called the SWEAT Act. And I forget what the acronym SWEAT stands for, but basically it gives workers the right to have a wage lien against the assets of the company that ripped them off. So we need stronger enforcement. We need the SWEAT Act passed. We need a change in regulations like, this one really bugs me, is there have been 3 court orders saying that the standard practice in the home attendant, home health care industry of 24-hour shifts, but the workers are only paid for 13 of those hours, even though they're responsible for 24 hours for people that need constant attention. They only get paid 13. And 3 appellate level courts in the New York ruled that's illegal, stop it. And the Labor Department, using federal precedents from, you know, right-wing courts around the country, issued an emergency regulation about a year ago now, almost a year, saying go right ahead. And they're having hearings on this right now. The home attendants have sued again in court, And that is being litigated right now, but the Governor Cuomo should, and I will, just repeal that legislation. I'd actually, be in favor of laws that say you can't have 24-hour shifts in that industry. You should have divided into 12-hour shifts. And if you work more than 40 hours in a week, you're required to get overtime. I mean, we have two big categories of additional workers: prison workers making 20 to 60 cents an hour, sometimes under contract for private companies on the outside, which depresses wages in the broader wage market, sometimes producing goods for the state, and farm workers. They don't have the rights in our Fair Labor Standards Act at the federal level. It's exempted here at the state level, including the right to a day of rest every week, the right to collectively bargain, the right to OSHA standards, and so forth. These should be extended to those workers. Another thing the state should do, and the state bank should have a division devoted to this, and that is to develop worker co-ops, where the net income, or quote-unquote profit at the end of the year, is divided to the workers according to the labor they contributed. So workers get the full fruit of their labor. Right now, basically about half of what we produce goes to the owners, who are a tiny minority compared to all the workers. So they're getting richer, and we're struggling to exist. So we need a fairer way of distributing at the beginning, not at the end. Progressive tax reform, tax and transfer programs can only mitigate the grossly inequitable distribution of wealth at what happens at the point of production. So you're going to add something.
I'm going to ask you, so if you could expound a little bit on the worker co-op thing, because I know it extends towards Syracuse as well. Like Top Supermarket is about to close a bunch of their stores, I think 10 of them, and we've actually started to float the idea a little bit. It's not going over very well, but where the workers from the two stores that are in the city here could actually, the ones who are going to be losing their jobs, get together and run one of the stores cooperatively. So is there a way the state government could help businesses that are going out of business or closing some of their shops to help the workers take over the business?
Absolutely, that's what the state bank would do. And let me just say the last piece of the anti-poverty program is that we should build into the progressive income tax structure what's sometimes called the negative income tax, a guarantee of a minimum income above poverty. And that should be a refundable tax credit paid out monthly, so that any low-wage worker or anybody that can't work for various reasons, too old, too young, disabled, raising young kids, can have an income so they are not in poverty. Okay, so how do we develop worker co-ops, and particularly like Tops? There's My Neighborhood Tops came in a few years ago after the PNC closed, and it's already closing. And that's a tough business. But what we can do with a state bank is do what the Mondragon Cooperative Network did in the Basque region of Spain. Started in the 50s. They couldn't do politics because you had the fascist Franco running the country. So under the protection of the Catholic Church, they started organizing co-ops, worker co-ops. And at the center of that was what they call the Bank of People's Labor. It is now an endowed institution in this Mondragon Co-op network that has grown from first a small appliance worker co-op to a network of over 100 industrial co-ops. 98% of the co-ops they started have been successful. Compare that to like a 20% survival rate of startups in this country after 5 years. These are good industrial jobs. They have billions of dollars in revenues and profits, and they have a whole consumer cooperative and social welfare network, pensions and so forth, healthcare that they provide. But what was key is that Bank of People's Labor, now an endowed institution, is like a university. And what it does is it looks for opportunities, does a business plan, then hires the managers and workers, and helps them get up, helps finance them, provides technical assistance as they go along. And if they run into trouble and workers have to find other jobs, they find them other jobs in other co-ops. That's what we should do. So there should be an entrepreneurial division of the state bank. That's whole purpose is to look for opportunities to develop worker co-ops and deal in situations where you have businesses closing down and see if it's feasible to keep the business open as a worker co-op. There was an effort for worker co-op owns grocery stores in Philadelphia back in the 90s. It was called O&O, which stood for Owned and Operated. And it was the AP stores that closed. and their union, I think it was the food and commercial workers, I'm not sure, helped them do it. They did not survive. You can't even find much about them on the internet because they were just before the internet really got going. But this has been tried before, and it's the kind of thing a state bank could provide assistance with and help workers organize. Somebody, and I wish I knew who because I want to get back in touch with them, sent me a proposal for actually a consumer co-op for Spectrum, and these are the striking workers down there in it's against Spectrum down in New York City, and they would like to take it over. So this is something else that a state bank with an entrepreneurial division focused on helping co-ops get started could help with. I think there are certain things I think they ought to get into right away, like these temp agencies, which take half the wage that the company that hires the temps is paying to the temp agency. The workers only get half of the fee. And now there is some overhead involved, but the rest goes to profits for the temp agency. It's a big industry. And an example of where temporary workers, home health care workers in the Bronx, there's a big co-op. It's been going for 20 or 25 years. That is, competitive, successful, and their home attendants get better paid, better benefits than most people in that industry down in the Bronx. So this is something that has been done, can be done, and with state support can be done on a much greater scale. And in terms of poverty, paying workers the full value of what they produce is how to get low-wage workers into, decently paid jobs.
Yeah, just a couple things. One is that I also think that the education system, I was listening to something today where different groups are trying to outreach a little bit to students, teenage students for job connection eventually. But it's usually just very minimal kinds of things. And it's, the education system in general should be including these maybe somebody does sometimes, but they usually don't do them. Should be including a lot of these options so that the students, a lot of people are kind of uncomfortable with the economic future, the feelings about it, and getting jobs and all that. So if people knew that this was an option early, and they could kind of be helped. The one thing we have, the thing in Rochester is a not-for-profit that is called Llc, I believe. And what she's doing is she's trying to work with people who want to be in the a cooperative owner, a worker owner, and laying some groundwork. But one of the big problems you get is that nobody knows. When you go to talk to a small business person or somebody who's moving, and they don't have a clue. And so there's minimal outreach by the current system. So something that's a little bit more systematic, as you learn about work and learn about whatever, that you include that. The second thing I want to ask you though also is about the position on guaranteed income, or your sense about it.
Okay, well, one of the best opportunities for worker co-ops is when retiring owners,
Yes.
instead of selling it to another, capitalist, they could sell it to their workers and get, their equity out of the business so they can have a nice retirement. And that's another place where you have a lot of opportunities. And in terms of letting people know what co-ops are, it is an issue of public education. It needs political leaders talking about it, explaining it, encouraging it, and pointing to the successes so other people will also get engaged in that movement. As far as the guaranteed income goes, I describe what I think we can do in New York State, and that is have a refundable tax credit, sometimes called a negative income tax, where you get paid monthly for to top up your income above the poverty line. So, if Social Security and you have some dependents isn't enough, the refundable tax credit will get you above the poverty line. If you're a single mom, maybe with a part-time job, this will get you above the poverty line. And so in a lot of ways that would replace cash assistance from the welfare system, but it would replace things like housing assistance, heating assistance, public housing, those other supports. And those should be available to people that are low-wage workers or getting most of their income from the negative income tax or refundable tax credit.
What about jobs that are, there's a lot of concern about jobs, certain categories of jobs being eliminated, technology and all that. So it's hard to know how much that will actually happen, but it's been talked about more lately. So if you had a situation where a lot of people who were like used truck drivers, who all of a sudden lost, a whole bunch, big numbers lost their jobs, and they didn't have many other options, just to make my point. Providing, one of my concerns, providing guaranteed income, even if you make it at a little below the poverty line, isn't really a good wage, so to speak, isn't a wage you can become middle class on. So if that kind of thing were to happen, or what is your response to that? Because
Well, I think our slogan should be, the German Greens had this early on, a fair distribution of work and income. Right, you don't want some people working and making more money and then other people on a dole and not, feeling useful. There's a certain, we want to make jobs where you express yourself, your creativity, your contribution to society, your sense that you're pulling your own weight. Those are important things. But if we do have the kind of automation you're talking about, like automated trucks and all the truck drivers are, suddenly out of business, then what we need to do is take those advances in productivity and distribute the gains equitably. So that could mean a shorter workday while maintaining income, and that requires planning. So, one of the things I'm saying is we need an ecological socialism where these economic rights are provided so everybody has a decent standard of living, and we do it on a basis that's ecologically sustainable. So the answer of the two major parties is, we'll solve poverty and raise living standards by growth. And so we got this blind, relentless growth, which the capitalists love because their whole thing is about accumulating capital. And they got to do it because if you don't compete and grow big, you're going to be taken over by bigger fish. So this whole dynamic is built into the system. So we've got to have a democratic economy where we can plan how we distribute the work, the income, and what kind of ways we're going to produce, for example, energy. I mean, in the late 40s, they were worried about running out of oil, so Truman had this commission called the Paley Commission to make recommendations on how we can have sustainable long-term energy. And he recommended solar energy. This is, early in the Eisenhower administration when it came forward with its recommendations. But for military reasons, Eisenhower chose, quote unquote, the peaceful atom. So we'd have a civilian nuclear industry next to the military bomb-making industry. And that was not a decision that the American people made. That was made by the military industrial elites. And we were just told what the decision was. We didn't even know we had the solar option, unless you were a policy wonk that read government reports. So the Paley Commission, is a footnote in history. And now, if we could go on that route, we probably wouldn't be worried about global warming. Because, not only is solar energy clean, it's cheaper. Once you build the infrastructure, the sun shines every day. You don't have to buy the fuel. You just harvest it. Same with the wind, which is a solar derivative. Same as with the geothermal ground source heat pumps. That's solar energy stored in the ground. The waves are, generated by the wind. There's also tidal, that's gravity, the moon. But it's all, natural energy that's all around us. And if we build the infrastructure to harvest it, we've got cheaper energy, which is good for the economy.
All right, I'm going to ask a political wonky question. That's kind of we were actually talking about it before anybody got here, but I just want to go into it again for folks who experience the answer a lot. Could you, based on your knowledge of how the ins and outs of how the campaigns are running? So tonight's primary election, and if things go the way the polls show, it'll be Cuomo is the Democratic candidate, and right now Cynthia Nixon has the Working Families Party line, but that's kind of up in the air for certain reasons. Could you just kind of explain your understanding of how that looks like it's going to play out?
Well, I think the way it's going to play out is if Nixon doesn't win, she's going to get out. Leaders in the working families have said repeatedly, when asked that question, we don't want to divide the Democratic vote, have a Republican get elected. They don't say a Green, but I like my chances. You're going to have 2 or 3 Clinton Democrats. You know, that would be Minor, Cuomo, and Nixon if she stays in, and 2 conservatives, the Republican and the Libertarian. You know, people don't know, you know, and Cynthia Nixon's calling herself a socialist suddenly because all those DSA people were boots on the ground she wanted. But she backed Hillary Clinton to the hilt against Bernie Sanders in the Democratic primary in 2016, maxed out in her donation in the primary as well as the general, gave $5,000 more to the Hillary Victory Fund, which the Sanders people were really upset about because it was cooperating with the DNC against Sanders. And, you know, she called herself a Clinton girl you know, during that campaign. So 2 or 3 Clinton Democrats. Now, how does she get off the line? It's a double move. She will, let's see, she will announce that she's going to run for this. No, there's a guy running for Deborah Glick's assembly seat named, I forget his name. He's a lawyer with the Working Families Party. He will be nominated for a judgeship that he probably can't win. When they have the judicial conventions, that happens after the primary. And then they'll replace him with Cynthia Nixon. And then offer the Working Families line to Cuomo. That would be the double move. And they got I don't know what they're planning to do with Chimani Williams, but he may stay on the Working Families line, I don't know. But, you know, we don't have that problem as Greens, because we're Greens. We know what we stand for. We're putting it before the people, and we're going to be in the general election. We're not deciding, no, we'll stop running because we're not on the Democratic line. I mean, that's what I was talking about earlier. They're really just a branch of the Democratic Party. They're the liberal wing. And they happen to have a ballot line the way New York election laws work. So, you know, we'll see what happens. And I'm not even sure how long it has to happen. There's probably a certain time in which she has to certify that she's on the Working Families line. Those judicial conventions, I don't think they happen. They happen, you know, like in a week or 2 weeks. So it may take some time to play out, but they'll probably announce their intention, you know, I would think, if not, you know, tonight, if she loses, by the time the weekend is out. But, you know, like I said at the beginning, whether she's in or out, we got to go beyond Cynthia Nixon if we're going to have real solutions to the problems we face. And that's why we're running as Greens. So, you know, whoever stays in or out of the election, we're in it.
Well, and you have folks who have been Bernie Sanders supporters who have been pushing Cynthia Nixon, it's DSA and a local group around here as well. And if they don't have her to support in the election, in the general election, in theory they need somewhere to go. And
well, if she does go out, you know, I'm going to send a message to those people. We feel your pain. We're here for you. We know you don't want to back Cuomo, so we're here for you.
Howie, you have a pretty ambitious program for climate change, for workforce, for infrastructure. How are we going to pay for all of that?
Okay, well, as I mentioned earlier, the top 1% in the state's share of income has grown from 12% of all income in the state in 1980 to 31% today. So imagine I'm the rich guy and I got 100 pennies. I'm going to take 31 of them and stick them in my pocket. And then you all go for the rest, you know. Some of you are going to get a few. You're going to be in the top 10%. And a lot of you are going to get one and you're going to be in the middle. And some of you are not going to get any. You're going to be on the bottom. That's the way income is distributed in our state. Now, that 1% of income last year came to $375 billion, going to 90,000 top 1% taxpayers. And I'm saying by having a more progressive income tax, keeping rather than rebating the stock transfer tax, which is pennies on a trade but generates in recent years $13 to $16 billion a year, and by clawing back the Trump corporate tax cut windfall to New York corporations, which may amount to as much as $10 billion, And they can keep it if they raise their workers' wages or hire more workers. But most of them aren't doing that. That's already in. We already know that. Walmart made a highly publicized bonus to their quote-unquote associates, and a couple of other companies did. Most of them just used it for stock buybacks and mergers and acquisitions and, management bonuses and, basically feathering their own bed. That, right there, the progressive income tax, we have a model we're going to bring out in a couple of weeks that we worked with an economist with. It would cut taxes in the bottom bracket from 4% back down to 2%, which it was in the 70s. Give some tax relief to the middle brackets, and then raise incomes on the higher brackets, particularly the higher 1%. So instead of just a single millionaire's tax, it would be brackets going up through the multi-millions. And that would generate, by our model, $10 billion. Say it's $15 billion for the stock transfer tax, $10 billion from the clawback of the corporate Trump windfall tax cut. And then there's some other things like an opioid addiction surcharge on those companies, the pharma companies that were pushing it. You go to my website, we have a number of smaller items in terms of numbers, but that's about $35 billion right there. And you put that much more into housing, transit, clean energy, roads and bridges, fully funding our schools, tuition-free college. That kind of money will pay for those things. That's how we'll pay for it, basically tax the rich. And then people say, oh, they're all going to move out of state. We've lost, how many hundreds of thousands of people in the last few years. We didn't lose hundreds of thousands of millionaires, first of all. Those are working class people that couldn't make it here. They're the ones leaving. And the millionaires are making their money here. I mean, we have studies on this, academic peer-reviewed studies. Stanford did a big one, I think it's last year now, not earlier this year. It was last year. And it found, and it did a nationwide study, and it found the rich don't move to get lower income taxes. They stay because, and this is more theoretical, the study just found the correlations. That's where their families is, that's where their property is, that's where their businesses is. They have a reason why they're living where they're living. And it's working for them because they're millionaires. Now you get highly publicized people like Golisano and Rush Limbaugh. But look at Golisano. Okay, he's not paying some income taxes. He is paying it on the money he's making in New York State. I mean, if you look at your state income taxes, they ask you, did you make money in Yonkers or New York City? And that's, you got an income tax, you got to pay that. He still pays income tax here. And you know it, you know him because he's around Rochester. He's whining like hell about the property tax. So, you can run, but you can't hide from the tax man. So these millionaires, they running away. They're going to be here and pay their taxes because they're doing good. And after they pay 10% more of the income they make, they're still going to be super rich. So they ain't leaving. Stop that. Yeah.
Have you incorporated establishing a state bank, and how much financial effect that would have?
How much effect do you think I would have?
How much of a financial effect would it have to create the state bank?
You mean where
would
would
it add to your ability to finance the programs?
I think it would have enormous effect. Basically, we bypass Wall Street. And
is that part of your plan, though? Has that been incorporated?
In terms of the fiscal plan?
Your current proposal that you're running on, is that part of it?
To have a state bank, to create a state bank, definitely is. And, the model here is the Bank of North Dakota. The Republicans up there love their socialist bank. It finances their farms, their businesses. They have more community banks per capita by far than any other state in the nation. And the good thing about community banks as opposed to, these big Wall Street banks is that they know who they're lending to. They know the character of the people asking for the money. They know their relationships in the community. They can make a much better judgment about whether a loan is worth giving, whether it's a home mortgage or a business loan. Whereas, Chase comes in and they got a template. It's like a cookie cutter. And they look at your financials and they see if they fit their template. They take no account of how hard you work, who you know, you know, how people regard you, which has a lot to do with whether a business succeeds or not. So the community banks, which makes for better local lending. And, you know, of course, as equal socialists, we prefer credit unions to community banks, but then there's a state law we got to change, which the commercial banks got a limit on how much business lending credit unions could do. So we need to change that if we're going to do more business lending through credit unions. But I, you know, personally, I have a community bank account. They give me a nice now account, 2% interest, and that's because I have to do a number of, you know, what do you call it, swiping the card, and they get a cut, and they can pay me 2% interest. I mean, where else can you get that? I mean, treasury bonds don't pay that. So I like that community bank. They're known for lending. In our community, we have enormous redlining problem. We haven't had an accurate study in about 15 years, but when there was Syracuse, right? When there was one, you know, Chase, Citi, all the big banks, Key Bank, they're all making, you know, like one loan to avoid the Community Reinvestment Act sanctions on the south side of Syracuse, the poor black community. Whereas the credit union and the Solvay Bank were making more loans, especially the credit union. Solvay Bank really didn't have as many customers from there because they got a branch downtown there in Solvay, a village, with a municipal power utility. Public power is another thing we need. On average, nationwide, they provide power at 13% less than the IOUs, investor-owned utilities. And if we're going to plan a transition to 100% clean energy, we can't count on National Grid or RG&E or Con Ed or Exxon or Mobil. Well, Exxon and Mobil merged, right? You know, Chevron. I guess Texaco merged into them. They're not many big oil companies. They keep merging, but we can't rely on them because they haven't done it to this point. In fact, you know, the oil companies have basically, you know, underwritten the climate science propaganda, the climate denial propaganda. And even though some of their early climate science, they knew that we were facing global warming. So.
Okay, transportation infrastructure, the railroads, like the line, particular lines between go from Buffalo to Rochester, to Syracuse, to Albany, New York City. Is that something you'll be focusing on and improve, or is that just not within your concern?
I think the immediate concern is MTA, and they've got a new guy who seems to be a good guy, Andy Byford. He's run London Underground, he's run the system, I think, in Melbourne and Toronto, and he just came up with a 10-year, $37 billion, and as you may have, you know, read in the papers, that system's falling apart. I mean, the trains are, it's almost half the time. It's not quite half. The subway system in New York City.
Right.
It's been neglected. Cuomo's stolen money from the MTA to put into the SPEP projects. It's been underfunded for decades through this austerity we've been going through since the 1970s. And it's time to reinvest in that. So there, and then upstate, the quickest way to get better public transit is improving the buses. And, you know, it's an opportunity to make them electric so they're not, you know, spewing not just greenhouse gases, but pollution with particulate matter that causes respiratory problems and health problems. So in the long run, I would like to see, first of all, light rail in the cities where it's feasible. People like that. You know, I think we may be headed to an age where these, you know, what do you call them, the ride-sharing systems, you know, those are platforms mainly, and they tend to monopolize. So maybe they should be public utilities, and the you know, the people, you know, providing the rides are public employees rather than independent contractors as they are now, to stabilize their working situation. And that might be a mass transit system, a sort of on-call system. I think that's something we need to study. I would like to consider light rails, the interurbans they called them, and they existed in this country, in the state, between the 1890s and the 1930s. And unfortunately, the state bought out the rights of ways to build state roads. But I talked to an old guy, he's passed on now, the first time I ran for governor. He said, Howie, you got to bring back the interurbans. And he talked how he was a working class kid in New York City. And with his, little money, he could get on the subways out to the edge of the city and then go on the interurbans anywhere in the state. And it was affordable for working class people back then. And that interurban rail system, I would like to see us look at. Everybody talks about high-speed rail. I think that's a good idea to reduce air travel. It's, by the time you get to the airport, wait, get on the plane, get off, get your bags. You can get on a train and get there faster. But that's expensive, and I don't think it's as high a priority. But I think we should move toward public transit. We may with the, this ride sharing, and it could even be automated without the drivers with this self-driving cars. I mean, that technology may not be here now, but it's coming fast. And so that may be the mass transit system within cities to get people around. So I think we gotta, get ahead of the curve and study those things and be ready to implement them if they make sense. So, but I think the immediate priority is to get the mainly bus systems upstate and the subway system downstate. But downstate, in the city, it's also the bus system, which supplements the subway system, which, because they have so-called transit deserts down there, which are a long way from subway sites. And then, first place I'd extend rail services out on Long Island. I mean, that's a parking lot, and those people are wasting a lot of time every year just sitting in traffic, getting to and from work. And so an improved rail system out there could help. And then the other big thing is the rail system. What do they call it? The system that Christie vetoed when they're about to go forward. It's been delayed, but it's now being worked on to improve the tunnels, the rail tunnels under the Hudson from New Jersey. Well, it's the PATH train, and then they got a name for it. I'm forgetting it right now, but that is a high priority too. And there's federal money involved with that.
I would just add to that, because we've done some work with transportation locally, and some of the communities in the city have gotten together to stand up for certain things. But the transportation system in New York is so heavily controlled between the governor and then the state people, and then most of the officials in our system locally are just a series of people that used to work for the county, i.e. Republicans and all that, so never use the bus. So one of the things that we're talking about, it wouldn't be easy to do, but is to turn some of these big pieces like transportation and there's some others into pieces that are more grassroots, that really have to go through a process of direct involvement, which is not necessarily easy to kind of structure, but it's doable. And there's a lot of interest in doing that in many things now, just because I think people have had it, that's enough, or that's other crap. So that's something that would be great to be able to talk about as a local example of some structural changes, because it's so set up by, even if they have little, the local transportation people are looking at the transportation system, and they kind of just give people the touch of, just a minimal thing by, doing surveys, and then all the surveys that are done don't necessarily equal out with the greatest need. So if you have people who totally depend on the bus, those people have less say than the people who use the bus 3 times a year. And so that could be changed, or could be, done a different way if we had more grassroots control, not just input, but control over that mechanism, over those mechanisms.
Well, I think we need a social solution to the lack of democracy in these public enterprises. Without democracy, you don't have socialism. You have state capitalism.
Yeah, state capitalism.
You have, public services that are underfunded and unresponsive. So there's a model that for a public energy system that came out, was actually published in the Congressional Record in 1974, just to show how far to the right the Democrats have come. It was put in there by Lee Metcalf, a Democratic senator from Montana at the time. And this is at the time of the Arab oil boycott and an energy crisis here. And a lot of those senators thought that big oil was holding the oil back to jack up prices and gouge. And there's a lot of evidence that they actually did that, because Most of our oil was domestic, and that oil that was coming in was coming from places like Venezuela, not Saudi Arabia or the Arab, the OPEC states. So they were saying, let's, nationalize the oil companies and take over the energy system. So a couple of progressive economists, Lee Webb, who was one of the original SDS guys, and Jeff Foe, who's still a progressive economist. He's based in Maine, but he works with the Economic Policy Institute, I believe, came up with a model state energy legislation. They used it, they put it up as a model for Vermont. But what I like about it was the governing structure. And what they did, it was a federated structure. They had local public energy districts. That would be like our municipals. We have 50 municipal utilities in the state. They're all mostly villages. But, and they work well. They provide the power for less than we get it from the IOUs. And so those boards for those public energy districts were going to be elected 2/3 by the public and 1/3 by the workers in the energy industry. And a similar model was developed by Ron Dellums. Basically, it was developed by the Civil Rights, or the what's it called? The Committee for Human Rights, which was the civil rights medics and doctors who patched people up after, the Bull Connors beat them up. And then got involved in the anti-war movement. And they wanted to deliver health services the best way. And it wasn't just a single-payer insurance system. It was a public service, a health service, like they have in the United Kingdom, Costa Rica, Cuba, I think Denmark, some other states or other countries. So the doctors are on salary. They're not, independent businesses, hospitals and so forth. And that also was going to be governed by boards that were elected 2/3 by the public, 1/3 by the health